Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Richard Chaplin from the Managing Partners Forum. Welcome you to episode 15 of Sharing Management, Business and Personal Challenges. We've got two big themes today. One, we're looking at innovation and trying to understand where firms are on their innovation journey, what levels of maturity they have. And we're also going back to a very basic skill, which is around communication and influencing, and asking how are we actually doing when we're trying to influence people as leaders? How effective are we in that role? Delighted to mention a fantastic panel. Before I do that, I just wanted to quickly share some of these strategies which you might want to think about for this new normal that we're now working in. Firstly, think big. It really helps to actually not just stick to the status quo, but believe some impossible things before breakfast. Lewis Carroll came up with that one, obviously. Remember that you are the power of your relationships and that you really do need to make sure they're two-way. Think small. Think about the things that will really resonate with your key clients. Think about doing campaigns. Think about themes that really matter to you, and then rather than one-offs. Drop the convention. Just go for some of the new ideas. Remember that speed is still very, very important. So you've got to be very clear. Articulate your assumptions. And if you find they're invalid, amend and pivot in the new direction. And then finally, be entrepreneurial, keep listening and innovating. And the key word there is actually listening, which most people probably forget, because if you're not listening to your clients, it's pretty unlikely that you'll come up with something that works for them. So that's adapted from Elena Kutsko of Globsec. Thank her for that. So let's look at now who's on today's call. Well, firstly, I'd like to mention Rosemary Nunn, who is the founder and MD of INK, the Innovation and Knowledge Agency, who has a fantastic career in the area of innovation and knowledge, and really looking forward to her thoughts. She has the tough task that we're going to be running the poll, and then she has to talk immediately afterwards, not having had a chance to see what the poll results are, because none of us know what these poll results are going to be. So that'll be fun. Jeremy's coming back every other week now, and he is the managing partner, as you know, of Hayes McIntyre. He has been very much taking us through how his firm has been working through from what do we do next to, I think, much more clarity, but let's hear from him shortly. Francesca probably needs no introduction for anybody who's been on this call before, on this show before, but she is very much, in my mind, the point person across the Grant Thornton network, very much has her fingers in every pie that's probably worth putting a finger into, and really knows what's going on in her world, which is great. And John, who hasn't been on the call before, who's the managing director of Cicero, which, as some of you will know, is a leading political consultancy. But today I said, well, let's not worry about the market that you play in, which is essentially politics and lobbying. Let's focus on the core comm skills that you and every other leader need in order to be effective in your role. And then finally, Lucy, who is going to our sort of almost resident, I think, anyway, from Bays, who's going to be kind of giving us a brief update on what's going on from the government side, and also, and I think it's really important, listening to some of these great conversations that we as this panel are able to have. So again, yours truly, obviously, as the host. So let's just quickly look back at last week's poll for some of you who were on the call, because it's quite interesting. First of all, one of the questions we asked you is, this is about inclusiveness, is what level of inclusiveness would you say was the sort of current level at your firm? And you can see here that at the top 5 is high, 0 is low. Most people, the biggest was 4s, slightly more 3s than 5s, so probably high 3s would probably be my average. Fine, and it didn't seem to make much difference whether the managing partner was responsible, or indeed whether somebody else was responsible for the inclusiveness agenda. This was kind of how people felt about their actual firm. When we then drilled a bit more, who's actually responsible, we found that it was either the managing partner or a board member who had 70% roughly were responsible. So again, that ticked a number of the boxes that the panel were interested in last week. Again, as you probably would expect, how often is inclusiveness discussed at management meetings? Again, when the managing partner is responsible, that's the blue column, much more likely to happen. When it's others, less so. But, you know, fair enough. This is where it got a little bit more interesting in many ways, because what this is saying was, are you actually setting formal targets, what you might call career progression targets, for people from, in this case, a BAME background? And even in the blue, which is where the managing partner was responsible, these numbers are really rather low, is I think an elegant way of putting it, in the sense that, and I think this is where the Women on Boards movement have shown the way. track the numbers, because that's the way you bring about the change. If it ain't measured, it ain't done, all that stuff. And I think a lot of firms need to look quite seriously, are we actually tracking these quite important career progression milestones within our firm for those from a BAME background? Because waiting for the dial to move around, say, the leadership level and the number of people in CEO roles, you talk about years, which, as someone said to me, is rather depressing. The other one, again, I think was slightly concerning to me, was that if senior management or leaders are exhibiting conduct which is not inclusive, and 46% never get reprimanded or sanctioned, according, obviously a bit less when the managing partner is responsible. So I think the message that's giving internally isn't a very positive message. And equally, maybe being we are who we are people influenced by movements like BLM? Well, honestly, not a lot, because in the pink one, over 70% are saying they're not that influenced. So sometimes maybe never. So I think there's some work there. And the managing partners on the call, we've got Tuesday, Segan's coming back for a managing partner members only meeting to actually explore that in a bit more depth with a group of managing partners to see if we can work out, is there anything behind these stats that's worth exploring? So that's the feedback from last week. There's some other charts as well. They're all in the management library, but I just thought I'd bring you some of those highlights, because again, I think there's some work there. I think it's probably the elegant way to put it. So just remind us, government obviously saying that what we're doing here is really valuable and very important. So here's your chance today to find out a bit more about yourselves as a group and complete this week's, we're calling it an innovation maturity poll. Okay, it's a fairly mixed bag. There aren't too many in the 1 to 5s. And I say most people are sitting at 6, 30%, and 7, 22%. Those are kind of the big numbers that occur when we're looking at, if you like, the overall innovation strategy, culture, process, leadership, like everything in terms of what level of maturity firms believe themselves to be. We'll now check whether the evidence below actually demonstrates that might be true or not. So first of all, how important is innovation in terms of growth and market share retention? 2/3 of you nearly saying that's an essential precondition, and I think nobody is saying it's unimportant or nice to have, and that's reassuring. Moving on to the extent to which it's a key touch point with clients, not quite as powerful as it is around being growth and market share, but it is clearly something that people, again, don't really think it's important, with about 30% essential and 60% or so important but not essential. And then the third of this trilogy, looking at innovation is important for OD, organizational development, 50% essential, 50% important. Again, nobody think it's nice. So people think it's important. That message coming through quite clearly, which is nice. Who's responsible? Again, 40%. The person with primary responsibility is the firm-wide leader or the CEO for actually driving innovation at the firm. And again, that's, I think, quite reassuring for most of us. So let's now move into the multiple ones, and these ones are slightly more interesting. And these are all standalone questions in a way, but they all in their own way effectively support or don't support what they've just said. So the first one is, about a quarter of you have defined processes for innovation, about a quarter a defined fund or budget for innovation, slightly more allow their innovation practices to access in existing knowledge. The one that's highest on the list is that it allows people to discuss and challenge ideas, that the culture, if you like, is around that. About a third see it as their clients driving their innovation investment, and about a half regularly discuss market changes and innovation with clients. Now, you kind of wonder what the other half are doing, but Rosemary will no doubt talk about that. And then 13%, none of them apply, which again may be a number that you would expect, but let's just see. Moving on to the next set of statements, fully documented innovation strategy, 10% less under, whoops. Someone is fully accountable for driving innovation, 37%, yeah, okay. Are people who are actually encouraged to share, 70%, that one's very much the kind of key element with innovation, I think. Yes, you've got to share. Mind you, 30% aren't being encouraged. That kind of worries me as well. Our firm fosters a culture of innovation to a significant extent, 40%. Fully aware of the culture, 35%. Fully engaged, 24%. That's kind of a low number, I would suspect. We see outcomes regularly for innovation, 37%. None of the above apply, 15%. So that's consistent. So where is these results being applied? Moving on to this question. Employee engagement is the absolutely area in which most results are being shown, the clear results are being shown. talent retention, about half. Workforce enablement, a little bit more, 60%. Talent attraction, quite low, and only 4% aren't being encouraged, which is not actually the same as the previous question, but that's not a key issue for me. And what are the areas in which which areas are being highly impacted by innovation at the firm? And again, the highest is operational efficiency, and then followed almost immediately by productivity, with talent attraction and attraction coming quite a lot lower. So it's seen as possibly much more of an internally focused activity rather than reaching out to people who might wish to be coming to work for you. It's kind of a message I might take from that. And again, a very, very small number, say none of them are impacted. And the final question really was, what are you actually doing in terms of what different models of innovation are you doing to a significant extent? And the one that's come out very clearly, the highest is innovation teams, but interesting, as Rosemary will have picked up, none of them are scoring you 50%. And even crowdsourcing, which some people I know are doing, is only 13%. So there's clearly quite a lot of the tools of innovation, or the models which aren't being deployed to a significant extent, which is 30% of the people obviously on the poll have said that. So that's probably about enough for my quick run through. It's given Rosemary some time to reflect on what she's just heard. So I will now stop that, and I will also stop sharing the screen, and I will hand over to Rosemary and ask her to talk us through what she's just heard and seen.
Great. Thank you very much, Richard. Good morning, everybody. I hope we are all well. As you know, these are 5-minute discussions, so I'm going to set my timer for 5 minutes. So I think that's really interesting. I mean, I'm going to pick out some of the key headlines there that struck me when I looked at that. 9% of organisations have said they have a strategy around innovation, whereas 87% have said that they see employee engagement outcomes as a result of innovation. And we know that employee engagement has a massive impact on productivity. And right now in our world today, we have probably seen one of the biggest inflection points, without question. We've seen one of the biggest inflection points ever. And hence we are probably going to see an impact on productivity in the following months. And certainly when we look back at the data, I think that we'll see that as evident across the economy. So for me, it's very clear that innovation has these significant outcomes: productivity, employee engagement, clients, talent, operational efficiency. And yet, as Richard alluded to at the end, the last question talked about how many people manage innovation in a precise and defined way. And again, that was incredibly low. So there were some high scores in there about the value that people felt they got when innovation took place, but there's no strategy. 91% of firms don't have a defined strategy, whilst 87% of firms are saying that there are employee engagement outcomes that lead to productivity, and that managed innovation is taking place in very few areas. So for me, that's a very clear set of 3 indicators that I would start to focus on if I worked in an organisation which didn't have an innovation strategy and that didn't have a managed way to look at innovation. So just going on a little bit to the 3 points that I wanted to share with you today. As Richard said, I've worked in this space for a long time, and also in the space of knowledge management. I mean, when I go and talk to organisations, what I find often is you say to them, what does innovation mean for you? It's a really exciting word. It's a word that was bandied around before this point of inflection, which is now my favourite way to describe what we're going through. Isabel Parker used it, and I really, really like it as a word. It's a word that everybody says frequently, but what does it actually mean? So I think sometimes you have to sit and look at your own organisation and think, how would I define innovation for my people, for my organisation, for my clients? How would I actually say what innovation means to us and the trajectory we're going to go on? Now, you can call that a strategy, you can call it a vision, you can call it whatever you want, but fundamentally, actually defining what innovation means for you is really, really key. That could be continuous improvement. That's a way of innovation that typically will hit your operating cost. It could be incremental innovation, where you do small things on a project or a client project basis so that you improve the way you do something piece by piece. It can be breakthrough innovation, and that's where you start to talk about these big changes in your service provision, these business model changes. And when people talk about digital transformation, sometimes people say to me, what does that actually mean? You know, what is digital innovation? What is digital transformation? So it's actually changing the business model of how you do it. And lots of people will use the Uber example. And the way that I describe that for people is they didn't invent the car, they didn't invent the taxi driver, they didn't invent the passenger, and they didn't invent the internet, but they brought it all together in a totally different business model. So innovation doesn't have to be about inventing the next amazing thing. It can be about how you mold what you already have available to you in a different business model. And that would really be a breakthrough stage in a very different way of looking at innovation. And depending on the ambition of your firm, your organization, that can define innovation for you. You don't have to start at the end. You can start at the beginning. Just start with continuous improvements or incremental steps. So the second point I wanted to mention today was about adaptation. The world has adapted in a way that none of us would have predicted 6 months ago. We would have all been sitting there saying, we can't do that, that's impossible, this is really hard. But actually, all of us have adapted, and we have seen technology adoption, particularly of these types of tools, you know, video and virtual connection, go through the roof. But what's the next stage of adaptation, and what does that look like? And so for me, in the last few weeks, I've been starting to look at, you know, what are the features that are going to be present in the business recovery and the adaptation that organisations are going to have to engage in to take full advantage of the new paradigm and where we're moving to. And so there are a few things that came out there for me that step into that innovation space. And they're around immersivity. And that's a word that I use cautiously because it sounds like what's everybody talking about, but it's that connection between the virtual world and our culture, and around how we make use of our knowledge assets in our business to drive business transformation and digital transformation moving forward, and around how we adapt our culture and that we make sure we really understand that moving forward in this new world, which will forevermore, in my view, be blended. And so I have to stop there, but hopefully I've triggered a few thoughts for people on things they can think about. Thank you, Richard.
Thanks, Rosemary. Jeremy, managing partner, obviously innovation is going to be on your agenda. Let's hear your thoughts on what we're talking about today around innovation and any other matters which you feel will be interesting to share based on the last couple of weeks since you were last on the show.
Thank you, Richard. Good morning, everyone. Yes, perhaps just a few comments first on the last couple of weeks. From my point of view as managing partner, and then I'll touch on innovation and perhaps also touch on, in advance of John coming on, some thoughts around communication as well. It's certainly, life is getting more stable, I would say, over the last few weeks. The return to work, return to working from the office is certainly gaining momentum. And I think we will see that happen for us fairly soon. Some of the challenges that still exist in the current climate are around our people and pay and their health and their circumstances, and these remain a priority for us. We've been very conscious of the whole cutting pay, cutting hours across the board, not across the board, furloughing, etc., etc. And we, as a management team, we've spent a lot of time talking about that, and we've been very keen to treat everyone as fairly as possible. But inevitably, that is really difficult, and that's a real challenge for us, particularly around pay and promotions. And almost. Those people that you're promoting are very valuable to the business. That's why you're promoting them invariably. So that has been a challenging areas for us, and we have a lot of discussions around that. As I say, lots of areas are back to normal, and we're getting back to a routine of our management board meetings and our agenda items there, and we are starting to think again and pick up the baton of strategy and innovation. Those sort of meetings and half-day meetings we think are a full day meeting on Zoom might be a bit of a challenge for most of us, but sort of breaking that down into smaller chunks to talk about that strategy piece for the business. In terms of innovation, yes, I mean, there's a few things, you know, I sometimes sit back and think, oh, blimey, what are we doing in this area? Are we doing anything at all? And you then stand back from it. And actually, there is quite a lot going on. There is quite a lot that is having to go on at the moment as a function of the situation we find ourselves in, certainly in terms of dealing with our staff, the way in which they work, dealing with our audits and the way in which we run audits. There's a lot of innovative stuff we're doing there, but you don't immediately think of it as innovation. You don't immediately see it as innovation, but actually there is some good stuff going on there. We don't have a precise and defined way, Rosemary, and that's one of the takeaways for today. We do talk about it. We've talked about an innovation team. We have an innovation team head. But just getting that moving and getting some sort of structure around that has, you know, I'll admit, has been a challenge for us. I do think we involve our people quite well. If I can perhaps just refer back to last week and the inclusiveness poll that you ran. Actually, yesterday we had a diversity forum for any member of staff who wanted to join. And that was excellent. And I'd encourage all organisations to think about that. I didn't run it at all. I wasn't involved, but of course I attended and I made a few comments at the end. But it was, you know, inspiring to listen to what people had to say. I was very proud, and I have to say at times I was very uncomfortable. But, you know, there's nothing wrong with that. It's how we react to that. So I would certainly encourage organisations to think about that. Just in terms of communication, which John's going to come on to, I suppose the key thing for us has been to think about who are our key stakeholders. And in that regard, for me as managing partner, it's my fellow partners, it's our staff, it's our clients, and then I guess it's the industry and the regulators, and that's what we need to think about. So we do have regular briefings internally for staff and partners. To a large extent, we rely on individual partners with regard to their communication with clients, but we are doing some broader stuff as a firm as a whole. And I, as managing partner, have shared pieces with all our clients through our newsletters, but to a large extent we rely on individual partners. But certainly internally there's been some very good stuff going on for staff and partners, and we're continuing to develop that. And also, you know, this forum, I join another forum of sort of mid-sized firms as well, of accountants. There's a regular forum within our international association that I touch base with. So that's important for me as well, to make sure that we're understanding and aware of what's happening in a broader sense across the market. Thank you. I think that's my 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. And as always, I love your honesty. It's refreshing. Many managing partners wouldn't admit that uncomfortable things come across their desk, but that actually, as you correctly said, it's the reaction that matters, not the fact that things need to be addressed. Francesca, your thoughts for today?
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Hi, everybody. I love this sort of whole discussion around innovation, because it's clearly something that we've all been struggling with for years, but it's brought into sharp focus when you're going through a pandemic or point of inflection. Rosemary, love that. We've all seen about, you know, luxury good perfume providers moving towards hand sanitizer. We've seen aircraft suppliers producing ventilators, and we've seen our own organisations doing things that might have taken 6 months or 6 years in some cases, happening in a matter of days. And that's driven by the absolute need to find answers in short periods of time. But it sparked this period of creativity, which, how do you capture that? How do you keep doing that? How do you make sure that that isn't just a moment that happened that we all look back on? How do you make that part of your culture, which is a massive challenge, I think, because creating a climate, a culture of innovation is not easy in professional service firms. We are people who give advice. We're people who have to get things right. We can't often innovate easily without running into all sorts of problems with regulators, rules, processes, and things we have to do. It's not our natural home ground. We're not running Netflix. We're doing something very different. But that piece around cultural change and having an ability to give some things a go in a spirit that's actually helpful to our businesses is hugely important for us, but more importantly, important for our clients. So I'll share two thoughts. I think there is a piece around getting comfortable with failure when it doesn't impact on your core running of your business. So trying things out and failing fast, having a go, trying something a little bit new. And I remember working with or talking to a client of ours, which was Brompton Bikes, a fantastic CEO. They're very innovative. They specialize in folding bikes. They have some really great tech. But the CEO of that has a failure fund. He actually has a far more Anglo-Saxon way of describing it, but it's a failure fund. And basically anyone can take a bit of money, have a go at something. They don't need to justify anything that they're doing. But if it's good, the firm backs them. And there's something that we as professional services can learn from that. There are things that we can try out. And I know I was working with a colleague who actually came up with a brilliant way of doing a quite a sort of dull processy thing in a really effective way, worked out how to do it, got it all signed off, and it saved days and days of people's time. It's that kind of culture of accepting that sometimes you have to try things out to see if they can work. The second piece, which I think is far harder, is how do you share that innovation when you've got multiple locations, multiple offices, or you're working in multiple countries. And in all true accounting worlds, we all love a committee, don't we? We set up a council or a committee, and that's what we do. But actually, there's a piece there around not making that a dull structural piece. It's about how do you make people comfortable with sharing their knowledge, sharing their IP with each other, even within the same organisation, having a robustness around the process so people are comfortable, it's been properly looked at, but people giving their time freely to teach other people how to fish. I've got this great idea. I know that it works. I will help you become proficient at using this thing. It might be an idea, it might be a service, it might be anything that's a really good way of driving it. So, for example, we have an International Innovation Council that enables people to put forward ideas. They go through a robust process, but then anyone can access that information. So I think there's a piece here about creating a culture where you can fail, creating a culture where you're encouraged to try things out in the proper parameters, but also encouraging people to truly share because it is about in a software way, it's about an open culture of sharing where people can take that information, and a bit like Rosemary said, you don't have to invent the internet, you just need to know how to make all the bits work better together. So that's all for me, Richard, for the moment.
Thanks, Francesca. John, welcome to the panel. John, as I mentioned, I think obviously, well, Jeremy's already mentioned, but is a managing director of a specialist communication company. But I also said to him, let's go back to basics today. Let's actually understand what is it that leaders need to really be thinking about in order to make sure that they're influencing. It's not really about communication, that's a broadcasting term in a way, but it's their influence and their ability to actually share with the audience and help that audience work around the same agenda that actually really matters. I sense. Over you, sir.
Thank you very much, Richard, and good morning, everybody. Actually, listening to the comments, I was reminded of the quote that necessity is the mother of innovation. And I think the coronavirus outbreak has certainly created that necessity that has forced us really to embrace things that we wouldn't have done before. I mean, you look at the adoption of Microsoft Teams in our firm, we've had it for months and months and months, and we thought, what's this, is pointless, video conferencing doesn't work. And then when you're actually forced to use it, you find that actually you have a far more efficient way of working rather than being on email constantly. So, I recognise a lot of those comments there. So I'm going to talk about influencing, and influencing really is a subset of the discipline of communications. And I'm just going to run through maybe 4 or 5, 6 key points, things to bear in mind. And it's useful for me to remind myself of these sometimes, because I was saying to Richard before, sometimes communications professionals are a bit like doctors, and they're not very good at following their own advice. They're good at giving it to other people. And the place I would really start when you're influencing is to have clarity of purpose. And I know people talk a lot about purpose at the moment, but I think if you don't have clarity of purpose, what are you about? What are you trying to achieve at the outset? You might achieve a communications or an influencing outcome, but it might not be what you were looking for, or it might fail. So I think you've always got to start with what are you trying to achieve? And I've heard a story, and it might be apocryphal, about Alistair Campbell, and I won't talk about it too long because he works at one of our competitor firms these days. But he'd go into a pitch and have all these sort of big wigs from the business around him. And the first thing he'd do is say, right, I'm going to give you all a piece of paper, and I want you to write down what your key message is. And everybody would write down their key message and ask them to read them all out. And invariably, every single person would read out a different interpretation or a different message or a different purpose. And the point is if you can't agree or you don't have a consistent message amongst yourselves, how can you expect the public or wider audiences to understand what you're trying to say? So I think that's very important. Falling out of your clarity of purpose, as I say, is clarity of message. And the message comes from purpose. Now, as a communications professional, quite often what we would do is create something called a message house, which is basically where you just write down in a structured way what your key message is and what the sub messages are and the evidence or the proof points that's underneath that. You can go on Google message house, and you can find out how to do it. If you're trying to influence, anybody can do this. It's useful to go through that discipline of trying to set out in a structured way what your message is. So that's the second thing. The third thing is to identify and understand your audiences. And I think, Richard, you talked about listening and the skill of listening earlier on. Quite often in communications or influencing, people are in what the military would call transmit mode. Transmit. But you can't effectively communicate. We all know this unless you're listening. And the listening is about understanding your audiences. So that means thinking about their motivations and their perspectives, and why should they care about what you want. And the number of times I speak to firms, they've got a product or a service that they want to tell the world about or get the government to take seriously or whatever, and they're like, why isn't anybody listening? Because they don't care. Like, actually, you've got to give them a reason to be interested in what it is you have to offer, which means turning it around and thinking from their perspective. Why should they take seriously what I have to say, or why should they listen to what I have to say? You should also go through the discipline of mapping those, particularly when it's a complex environment. Okay, if it's a couple of people and you know who you're trying to influence, that's fine. You don't need to do this, but the discipline of mapping your audiences is quite important. So who are the people in the media you might want to talk to? Who are the people in the political world? Who are the people in the policy world? Who are the staff? Who are the stakeholders? And try and put that in a map. You can draw it on a piece of paper or put it in a spreadsheet, because that means that you sort of track and understand who it is you're trying to reach. The fourth thing is building trust. And I was struck when and Richard, you talk about Jeremy's comments and Jeremy's honesty in what he was saying. That honesty builds trust. And I would say that building trust with your audiences is incredibly important. And that means not bamboozling them and sometimes being frank with them. That's not always possible. And that doesn't mean not being dishonest, but sometimes you can't tell the whole truth, but you should be as frank and as open as you can be, because people are pretty good at sniffing out stuff that's a bit dodgy, frankly. So I think building trust is incredibly important if you're going to have credibility. But sometimes it's not possible to build trust because the audience you're trying to communicate with is just in a completely different place to you. And when that happens, you have to think about the influencers of the influencers. Who is it that those audiences do trust? Who is it that they listen to? And how can you persuade those people to influence the people that you're trying to influence? So sometimes you have to be indirect. But I think that idea of building trust, and that takes time, is incredibly important in successful influencing and communication. Fifth point, don't focus your energies on people who are already massive supporters, who are already in your corner, because they're already with you. And this is a tendency that I see quite a lot, that people want to preach to the choir, speak to the converted. And that's not a good use of your energies or your time, because they're all going to be your advocates. Alternative, and also importantly, if you think somebody's never going to be persuaded and there's nothing you can say, then again, it's probably not really worth spending lots and lots of time trying to persuade the people who will never be persuaded. The people you really need to focus on are those who you can, are what we would call swing voters in politics. And that's if you look at, to take politics, that's the way a lot of politics is done now. It's not about trying to persuade your core vote all the time or trying to win over the other side. It's about trying to move the people in the middle. Now, that can lead to sometimes overly cynical communications. So I'm not saying that that's always got to be the approach, but equally, you know, point your energies where they're most likely to be effective. And finally, I'm going to do my sales pitch now. When the stakes are high, I think it is important to consider bringing in professional support. Now, I'm a political consultant, so I'm not always the right person. In fact, often I won't be, but there are professionals around internal communications, around media communications, around investor relations. And it's interesting, and particularly with professional services, you know, I wouldn't go and do somebody's audit. I can't give management consultancy advice. And I wouldn't give legal advice. I can't. These are all specialisms. They're all protected. But interestingly, I do find with professional services firms that there is this tendency for the partners to think that they can do these things themselves, even though they sell professional advice themselves. So, you know, there are times when it is worth spending the money to bring in professional advice, people that know what they're doing. And this is not necessarily because of just skill, but I think there is a value that comes from detachment. And this is where I want to go back to where I started. Communications professionals aren't always the best at doing communications for themselves. And the reason is we're all human, and you need detachment sometimes to be emotionally apart to craft a good communications and influencing strategy. Because, you know, if you've spent your whole life working in a particular field or in a particular mindset or developing a thing that you're really emotionally attached to, it's extremely difficult sometimes to have empathy with people from outside who don't think what you're doing is a great idea, who want to slow you down, who don't support you. So I think sometimes that external perspective is important and valuable. So those are six tips from me, and I'm very keen to talk about that in the Q&A, if you'd like to.
Thanks very much. Many words of wisdom there, and I think your point about detachment, and we can all get very focused on our own agenda and think that only what we think about matters, and spend tons of time just talking to our advocates. Talk to the advocates, but use them as your ambassadors. That's my view. In other words, get them on side, because then guess what? You've got not just you trying to push out a message, but you've got lots of people helping you. Forum's good at that, and we have to be. Lucy, do you want to come and say a few words from government's perspective? Just catch up. I know you couldn't make it last week, but just kind of anything that you think is worth sharing, and then we'll go into the panel session.
Yeah, of course. So just a quick update. We have released the Safer Working tool, which has been launched, and it's a great guide on how to get your workplace ready. So although some of you might not be thinking about that just yet, it's definitely worth a look. I also wanted to cover diversity and inclusion and innovation in kind of themes of this webinar. In terms of diversity, we've been looking at our own kind of D&I action plans and having the very much needed conversations on race. And that's kind of gone on to as well our support for schools and the return for schools, as we're kind of well aware about the concern that the impact it will have on women and part-time employees. So the lack of return to schools, sorry, I think my internet's going a bit funny. I did drop out earlier. It's okay, good, brilliant. I'm flashing on the screen. Yeah, so what we're doing with that is we're putting funding in to support schools over summer, and hopefully that will help kind of reduce some of that pressures. It would be great if we could get any feedback on this, particularly across medium-sized firms in the sector, as it's something quite important that we think we're really going to kind of need to narrow our focus on. And then in terms of innovation, we're kind of looking at next steps now. We've sort of stopped firefighting, and we're looking at mainly digital skills. I think as some of the other panelists mentioned, it's kind of been a great savior in these times, and I think going forward it's going to be particularly prevalent with the way we work and the return to normal. So yeah, so again, we're mainly in a listening capacity, but feedback's always welcome.
Thanks. And as I think everybody on the show knows, I mean, if there is an issue that you would like government to respond to, drop me an email, and I've agreed I'll curate them for Lucy and Bays generally, and they may then need to go to other parts of government to get an answer, but they're happy to do that on your behalf because they're a team that is, they call the PBS team for a reason. Right, we've got about 10 minutes, a little bit over, just to kind of pick up, and we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A, which is great. There's one for Rosemary. From Paul, maybe he wanted to hear what your third point was, because I know your 5 minutes kind of ran. Do you want to? Can you see that question? Okay, Rosemary. If not, it's he'd like to know on the next steps that firms can take to change forward. Is it change forward, charge forward? I'm not quite sure. Anyway, in the next stage, hopefully business recovery. So hopefully that makes sense. Over to you, sir.
Okay, sure, no problem. I think that, I mean, it's very subjective. Obviously, each organisation is facing a different pathway, depends upon your sector, your size, etc., whether you're global, national, one office, multiple offices. So there's lots of variables that need to be addressed. I think the first thing, it comes back to a little bit what John was saying as well. If you define and understand what it is that you've got in front of you that you need to assess, that really does help. It sounds really basic, but just write down all the things that you need to consider and look at. In my particular space, when you talk about innovation and knowledge management and knowledge assets and all of those sorts of things, I would really say if the question is specifically around how can we move forward in the new paradigm around innovation, I think the first thing is to try and think what innovation means for your organisation, put the simple statement together, start a strategy, and then look at ways that you can manage innovation across your organisation. So they can range from, I've designed and developed and delivered a massive crowdsourced innovation program for an organisation, 70 countries, 27,000 people, pretty crazy, but it really worked and it was really good. Obviously I would say that, but actually it really did. And then on the other side of it, at the moment we're doing a type of crowdsourcing around a smaller organisation, where we're just literally running calls, hourly calls, where people can drop in and they can share their thoughts and ideas and questions about the future. So that's a very simple communications approach that has also worked really well to reach out. And that was a 2,000 person organisation, which is quite locally gathered in terms of geography and region. So that really worked. So there's a whole spectrum of things that you can do to move forward. It's quite hard to sort of answer that specifically without knowing, what sector you're in and the size of your firm and those sorts of things. But really, I'd say don't try and boil the ocean, just start. And that's really the key thing. Just make a start. Hopefully that helped.
Thank you. There's a question from John here, and I think maybe Jeremy might have some thoughts on this around attitudes, in the sense of, are your people and your clients more tolerant of innovation? Are they willing to accept the failure fund, which I think Rosemary was talking about, or some slightly ruder word? And if that is the case, how are you thinking about maintaining that willingness to tolerate new things?
Certainly, in the current situation, both colleagues and clients are enormously stretched and challenged. So anything that we're implementing at the moment that is new has to be relatively low risk, and has to be, people have to at least be able to see that it's the right direction of travel. They are, both colleagues and clients have been so we have introduced new ways of working. And both clients and colleagues have been extremely tolerant of that. And in some instances, that is taking more time, but they can see the benefit of it in due course, and can actually see a very positive benefit of it in due course. So I think, yes, people are tolerant, but I would say it's probably, Rosemary may disagree with me, it's probably not a time for us to be looking at high risk innovation that may or may not fail, when actually people's time is really challenged at the moment anyway. So hopefully that answers. Perhaps just add to the comment, what I do, we've had to innovate at this time in terms of some of our processes, and that's where people have been tolerant, can see the benefit of it. I think what this will enable us is to be more innovative going forward, with clients and with colleagues, and push on once we're in a better environment. So I think there is certainly lots of positives that are coming out of it at the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I mean, John, do you have any thoughts on that issue? I mean, you've worked in Washington, D.C., you're obviously in London, so you've had that sort of what I call more of a cultural perspective. You presumably are seeing, again, clients being more tolerant of new way of your advice being different maybe, or from perhaps where it was before, because the world's changed. Do you think that's a cultural thing, or do you think it's just a blip?
I think the jury's out on, because the way my business operates in many respects has not changed. It's the delivery mechanism that's changed. We're doing it through video conference instead of face to face, but we're still, a lot of our work is written, our briefings are done on the telephone. So in some respects, what we're doing hasn't changed that much. In terms of our interface with clients, what has changed is the way that we're trying to communicate with the audiences we're trying to influence, because a lot of that would be done face to face, and now that's being done remotely. Events that we would usually do are not possible to do. People's attention is on other things. Just about this question about tolerance of innovation, I would say that the pressure to innovate is probably coming strongly from almost the front line of the company, and the blockages quite often are in the senior management, because there is so much focus on firefighting, or has been over the last few weeks. And I think it's interesting to see whether, when the dust settles a bit, whether a firm like ours will spend a bit more money or time looking at ways that we can actually improve our service delivery and make it more efficient.
Thanks. And Mike, thanks, Mike, for the question. And Mike, I know, is based in the UAE, and therefore this is his weekend. So thank you for joining us on a Saturday, sir, so to speak. But your point, and again, I think it's picked up John's point in a way, is that, yeah, if you're getting pressure from your front line and the leadership aren't possibly showing that clarity of purpose, are we talking here about the need for leaders to develop new leadership skills? Rosemary, do you want to have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. I don't know if there's new leadership skills that are needed. I think new leadership skills, or perhaps people's leadership, has been tested during this time. I don't think people get to the top of organisations of the ilk that are part of this group without having good leadership skills. I think in reality, we don't necessarily all use those skills on a daily basis. We are moving into a new phase. We are moving into a space where we need to adapt. And I think a good leader has the ability to adapt, their own perspective, and the ability to lead their organisations through an adaptation phase. And I think that is key. I would say, really, most leaders, I would hope, have those skills because they're leaders. But I think those skills are going to be tested even more in the next 18 months, perhaps, than they have been in the last 3 months. And that's going to be interesting.
Yeah, welcome back. I mean, then maybe the second question that arises from that is, have the leadership selection processes, and will they change if people now think we need a different sort of leader to cope with this new normal? Francesca, just, are there any sort of final wrap-up thoughts you have on innovation and some of the key topics we've been talking about today? And then I think we'll have to close at that stage.
Yeah, sorry about that. All the Wi-Fi went down. 2 quick points from me. I think in terms of what kind of leader do you need in the future, you need somebody who is very comfortable working in this volatility. And that isn't going to be everybody. So a massive shift there towards agility, volatility management. And in terms of the question that John asked, I think there's a huge piece here around it depends. If you are trying to manage in innovation and being willing to fail on certain things, it depends on the client's appetite, their understanding of what you're doing, but also a real clarity. And I think this ties in beautifully with the communications point that John was speaking to, is be really clear about what you're trying to do. Make sure that people understand and have an acceptance of where they're willing to accept a little bit of innovation, and actually where they're not, which is all part of building that openness and transparency about what you're doing.
So really just now wrapping up quickly, if I may, for those of you who have not been on the call before, all the videos are available in the management library. You all have access to it. Your email is actually the thing that matters, so don't pass the link to somebody else because their email has to be approved, but you are all approved, everybody on this call. That happens that way. And basically, I think you probably will hear from experts. We're now fortnightly. And next Wednesday, we're looking at where can learning and development expertise add most value in the new normal. And that's quite interesting in a way, because most people think of L&D being about purely knowledge sharing or training. But actually, if you actually talk to most L&D people, they would say we're probably the people more than anyone else who actually create the peer groups within the organization, which can then work together across the more traditional boundaries. So where can that expertise be best deployed in the new normal? Is that a resource that people, if they're furloughing their leadership teams, and I know some are doing that, their L&D teams, is that actually a really good way to move forward in terms of your thinking? And so finally, hope you found today valuable. Please encourage people. Next week, we're going to move in a slightly different direction. I won't say very much. There'll be an email coming out shortly, but briefly, I say that we're probably now thinking that after 15 weeks of sharing challenges and picking up some of the things that Jeremy was saying, we're probably now thinking about, okay, where do we go now? And more the planning, and let's sort of refresh what we're doing without, as Jeremy said, trying to take people in a space direction they don't want to go in. So I think we're going to see a shift in this show, and hopefully you'll stay with us. I know the panels will, and we're looking forward to the same structure because that really does seem to work. But thank you all for being a great audience, and as always, please consider supporting our work, and I know I'll be in touch with a few of you because at the end of the day we have a milk bill to pay as well. So on which happy note, I shall leave you for a lovely weekend. Sorry the weather isn't quite as nice as yesterday, but quite frankly, if you're at home and the room faces south, you are not wanting hot weather. End of story. Bye for now.